He thought she couldn't leave him and bullied her, but she married a CEO, leaving him regretful. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. My heart is full of joy seeing you all here again. The story of Hazel and Stanley touched many hearts, showing us the power of true love and inner strength. To my precious new family members, welcome home. You'll find nothing but love and warmth here. A prayer for healing. Dear God, bring comfort to those who suffer, filling their hearts with hope and peace. Send strength to the weary and light to those in darkness. Shield those battling depression and remind them they're deeply loved. Guide all precious souls toward brighter days where joy blooms again. Amen. If you enjoyed our journey together, please comment that you're satisfied, because your happiness is my greatest joy. Let's continue sharing these beautiful moments as one family. With all my love, Mr. Peter. The last glimmers of sunset painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of amber and gold. But Hazel Inessa barely noticed the spectacular view from her 47th floor office at Crimson & Crown Publishing. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with practiced precision, copper-toned skin illuminated by the soft glow of her monitor. At 24, she was the youngest senior editor in the company's century-long history, though few knew the determination that lay beneath her gentle demeanor. Red ink marks adorned the manuscript spread before her, her elegant handwriting filling the margins with insights that would transform a promising story into a masterpiece. This was her gift, seeing the diamond in the rough, the poetry in the prose, the bestseller in the bargain bin submission. Tonight's project was special. A debut novel from an unknown author that sang with the kind of raw talent that made her heart race. The office had fallen silent hours ago, the usual bustle of Manhattan's premier publishing house giving way to the soft hum of heating vents and the distant wail of sirens 47 stories below. Hazel preferred these quiet hours when she could lose herself in worlds of words without interruption. Her coffee had long since gone cold, forgotten beside a stack of contracts awaiting her review. The elevator's distinctive chime shattered her concentration. Heavy footsteps echoed through the empty office, growing closer with deliberate purpose. Hazel's hands stilled over her keyboard as a shadow fell across her desk, tall, imposing, and undeniably masculine. "Another late night, Miss Inessa." The voice carried the weight of old money and Harvard privilege, smooth as aged whiskey and twice as intoxicating. Hazel looked up slowly, meeting eyes that reminded her of steel in winter, cold, gray, and unyielding. Jonah Vincent stood before her desk like an emperor surveying his domain, which she supposed wasn't far from the truth. At 32, he'd inherited Crimson & Crown following his father's unexpected passing 6 months ago, and with it, control over the literary dreams of countless authors and editors. "These manuscripts won't edit themselves, Mr. Vincent," Hazel replied softly, but her voice carried an undercurrent of quiet confidence that made his eyebrow arch. She noticed his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, the platinum Rolex glinting at his wrist, the artfully tousled dark hair that probably cost more to maintain than her monthly rent. Everything about Jonah Vincent screamed privilege and power. "I need those acquisition contracts reviewed by morning," he said, gesturing to the stack of papers she'd set aside. "The board meeting." "We'll have them ready," she finished, holding his gaze. "I always deliver on time, Mr. Vincent." A flicker of something, annoyance, admiration, crossed his face. "You've built quite a reputation in your short time here, Miss Inessa. The youngest senior editor in Crimson & Crown's history. My father spoke highly of you before he passed." The mention of Richard Vincent sent a pang through her chest. The elder Vincent had been her mentor, the first person to see past her quiet exterior to the fierce literary passion beneath. He'd promoted her against the board's wishes, standing firm in his belief that talent mattered more than years of service. "Your father was a great man," she said softly. "He understood that stories have the power to change lives. Stories are commodities, Miss Inessa. And Crimson and Crown is a business, not a charity." Jonah's voice carried an edge that made her spine stiffen. "Speaking of which, what's this manuscript you've been championing to the editorial board?" He reached for the marked-up pages on her desk, but Hazel's hand shot out, covering the manuscript protectively. Their fingers brushed, and an electric current seemed to spark between them. Jonah's eyes widened fractionally, and for a moment, the mask of corporate indifference slipped. "It's a debut novel," Hazel explained, withdrawing her hand slowly. "The author's voice is unlike anything I've encountered in years. Raw, honest, compelling, and completely unknown," Jonah cut in. "No platform, no credentials, no guarantee of return on investment. The marketing department's report—" "With all due respect, Mr. Vincent," Hazel interrupted, surprising them both with her boldness. "Marketing reports don't capture the magic that makes readers fall in love with a story. This book has that magic." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Jonah studied her face, as if seeing her properly for the first time. Gone was the meek editor he'd expected to intimidate. In her place sat a woman with fire in her eyes and conviction in her voice. "You really believe in this manuscript?" he asked, his tone softer, curious. "I believe it could be our next bestseller," Hazel responded without hesitation. "Sometimes the greatest stories come from unexpected places, Mr. Vincent. Your father understood that." The mention of his father again made Jonah's jaw tighten. He straightened, adjusting his already perfect tie. "Your job is to edit books, Miss Inessa, not question my judgment on acquisitions." "My job is to find and nurture exceptional stories," she corrected gently. "That's what makes Crimson and Crown different from other publishers. We don't just print books, we create legacies." Snow had begun to fall outside, fat flakes swirling past the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights made them glow like falling stars, casting strange shadows across Jonah's aristocratic features. For a moment, Hazel thought she glimpsed something vulnerable in his expression, a crack in the armor of the corporate prince. "You're different from the other editors," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "They all scramble to agree with whatever I say, desperate to prove their worth. But you—" He trailed off, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself," Hazel replied, turning back to her computer. "Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Vincent, these contracts won't review themselves." She felt his presence behind her for a long moment, like a storm gathering strength. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Jonah Vincent turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed through the empty office, followed by the soft chime of the elevator. Hazel released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cold coffee, mind replaying the encounter. Jonah Vincent was everything she'd heard. Arrogant, demanding, used to getting his way. But there was something else there. Something that called to the editor in her. Like the manuscript she loved best, he was a story with depths yet to be explored. The snow continued to fall as she turned back to her work, but her thoughts kept drifting to steel-gray eyes and the electricity of that brief touch. Hazel shook her head, pushing the memory aside. She had manuscripts to edit, contracts to review, and a debut novel to champion. Romance had no place in her carefully ordered world. Little did she know, fate and Jonah Vincent had other plans. In the executive elevator descending to the lobby, Jonah loosened his tie with unsteady fingers. The image of Hazel Inessa's defiant grace haunted him, The quiet strength in her voice, the passion in her eyes when she spoke of stories. She was nothing like the social climbers and yes men he was used to dealing with. The elevator doors opened to the marble lobby, and Jonah strode out into the snowy Manhattan night. He had a publishing empire to run. He couldn't afford to be distracted by an editor, no matter how intriguing she might be. But as his driver held open the door to his waiting town car, Jonah found himself looking up at the light still burning on the 47th floor. Hazel Inessa was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, a story he couldn't put down, and Jonah Vincent had always been drawn to dangerous stories. Chapter 2. Walls of Glass. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of Crimson & Crown Publishing, turning the modern office into a crystal palace. Jonah Vincent stood at his father's old desk, his desk now, watching the bustling editorial floor 47 stories below. His attention, as it had been increasingly over the past weeks, was drawn to one particular figure. Hazel Inessa moved through the office like a whisper, her presence subtle yet undeniable. She wore a simple emerald green dress that made her copper skin glow. Her dark hair swept up in an elegant twist that exposed the graceful line of her neck. Every author who emerged from her office wore the same expression, a mixture of inspiration and awe. She had a gift for nurturing talent, for seeing the best in people's work and drawing it out with gentle persistence. It infuriated him how much his company needed her, how much he needed her. "The quarterly numbers are in, Mr. Vincent," his assistant announced, placing a thick folder on his desk. "And Miss Inessa's debut author is trending on social media. The pre-orders are exceptional." Jonah's jaw tightened. The manuscript he'd dismissed, the unknown author he'd doubted. Hazel had been right about both. The advance reviews were glowing, the industry buzz deafening. She'd turned a rejection into a triumph and done it without a hint of smugness or self-congratulation. "Send her up," he ordered, turning from the window. "I want a full report on the marketing strategy." Minutes later, Hazel entered his office, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. The morning light caught the subtle gold threads in her dress, making her seem to shimmer as she moved. She carried herself with quiet confidence, unintimidated by his power position behind the massive desk. "Good morning, Mr. Vincent," she said, her voice carrying that melodic softness that somehow commanded more attention than a shout. "I have the marketing breakdown you requested, along with the latest publicity schedule." "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair across from him. He watched as she settled gracefully, crossing her ankles in a ladylike pose that seemed almost antiquated in the modern office. "Your pet project seems to be causing quite a stir." "The silent season resonates with readers because it speaks truth," Hazel replied, opening her portfolio. The author's voice. "I'm more interested in numbers than literary merit, Miss Inessa." He cut her off, reaching for the report she'd prepared. Their fingers brushed again, and that same electric current jolted through him. Hazel's breath caught audibly, her dark eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before dropping to her lap. Jonah flipped through the pages, trying to focus on profit projections and marketing demographics, but his mind kept wandering to the subtle scent of jasmine that seemed to surround her, the way her fingers absently traced the edge of her portfolio, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. "These numbers are impressive," he admitted finally. "But one success doesn't change company policy on unknown authors. With respect, Mr. Vincent, taking calculated risks on new voices is exactly what built Crimson & Crown's reputation." Hazel's voice took on that quiet passion that transformed her from beautiful to breathtaking. "Your father understood that innovation." "My father is dead," Jonah snapped, regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Hazel flinched slightly, but held her ground. "Yes, he is," she said softly, "and he left behind a legacy of excellence and innovation that deserves to be honored." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Jonah stood abruptly, moving to the window to escape the intensity of her gaze. The city sprawled below them, a maze of glass and steel that seemed simpler than the emotions churning in his chest. "Have dinner with me?" he said suddenly, the words surprising them both. Hazel's reflection in the glass showed her startled expression. "I'm sorry. Dinner," he repeated, turning to face her. "Tonight, there's a new French place on Madison that's impossible to get into. I have a standing reservation." "That wouldn't be appropriate, Mr. Vincent." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Since when has appropriateness ever helped anyone succeed?" He moved closer, leaning against his desk, too close to her chair. "You want to climb higher in this industry? I'm offering you a ladder." Hazel stood slowly, gathering her portfolio. Even in her heels, she had to look up to meet his eyes, but there was no submission in her gaze. "I prefer to build my own stairs, Mr. Vincent. My work speaks for itself." She turned to leave, but Jonah caught her wrist. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, soft despite the strength he knew lay beneath. "Why do you resist me at every turn?" he demanded quietly. "Any other editor would jump at this opportunity." "Perhaps that's exactly why I don't," Hazel replied, gently but firmly extracting her wrist from his grip. "I'm not interested in being any other editor. I'm interested in being the best editor I can be." "You're different," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Every other editor tries to impress me, curry favor, gain advantage. You just work." "Maybe because I'm more interested in impressing myself," she answered, stepping back. "The manuscript reviews for next week's acquisitions meeting are on your desk. I'll have the contract revisions done by tomorrow morning." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Jonah watched her go, his hand still tingling where it had touched her wrist. Through the glass walls, he could see his employees scurrying about their day, but his eyes followed only one figure as she made her way back to her office. Later that afternoon, he found himself drawn to the editorial floor. The excuse of checking on contract revisions felt thin even to him, but he needed to see her again, to understand this power she seemed to hold over him. Hazel's office was a haven of organized chaos. Manuscripts were stacked in neat piles, each with color-coded sticky notes protruding from their pages. The walls were lined with books, not the leather-bound classics for show that adorned most executives' offices, but well-worn paperbacks and hardcovers, clearly read and loved. She sat surrounded by papers, lost in her work, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. The late afternoon sun caught the subtle red highlights in her dark hair, creating a halo effect that made her look almost ethereal. Without her noticing, Jonah watched as she bit her lower lip in concentration, making notes in the margins of a manuscript with that elegant handwriting he'd come to recognize. "You're still here," he said finally, making her start slightly. "So are you," she countered, removing her glasses. "Did you need something, Mr. Vincent?" "Jonah," he said impulsively. "When we're alone, call me Jonah." Hazel's eyes widened slightly, but she kept her composure. "Was there something specific you needed, Jonah?" The sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected thrill through him. "Walk with me," he said. "It's nearly 7 and you've been at that desk for hours." She hesitated, glancing at the manuscripts surrounding her. "I really should finish." "The work will still be here tomorrow," he interrupted, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Please." Perhaps it was the please that did it, so rarely used in his vocabulary. Hazel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just a short walk," she conceded. They rode the elevator down in charged silence, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. In the lobby, Jonah guided her toward Bryant Park with a light hand at the small of her back. The early evening air was crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. "Tell me about the book," he said as they walked. The one you're reading now. Hazel's face lit up with that inner fire that transformed her from beautiful to radiant. It's a historical romance, but with a fascinating twist on time perception. The author weaves quantum physics theories into a love story spanning centuries. Jonah found himself mesmerized, not by the story she described, but by the way she described it. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke, her voice taking on richer tones, her entire being animated by genuine passion for the written word. "You really love it, don't you?" he interrupted softly. "Not just the books, but the whole process. Finding the diamonds in the rough, polishing them until they shine." Hazel stopped walking, turning to face him. The setting sun painted her skin in shades of gold and rose. "It's not just a job for me," she admitted. "Each manuscript is a piece of someone's soul, entrusted to us to help shape and share with the world. That's a sacred responsibility." "I used to feel that way," Jonah confessed, surprising himself with his honesty. Before my father died. Books were magic then, portals to other worlds. Now they're just products on a spreadsheet." "They can be both," Hazel said gently. "The best businesses understand that passion and profit aren't mutually exclusive. Your father taught me that." "You speak of him often," Jonah observed, a note of tension entering his voice. "He was my mentor," she said simply. "He saw something in me when others didn't. Like this company, I am partly his legacy too." The honesty in her words struck him like a physical blow. In her, he could see his father's vision for Crimson and Crown, not just a profitable business, but a nurturing ground for literary dreams. It was a vision he'd been too angry, too hurt to carry forward. "Have dinner with me," he said again, but this time there was no command in his voice, only request. Hazel looked up at him, the last rays of sunlight making her eyes sparkle like dark honey. "Why?" "Because you make me remember what it was like to believe in magic," he answered truthfully. "Because you challenge me, frustrate me, fascinate me. Because I want to know who you are beyond the manuscripts and meetings." A soft smile curved her lips, and for a moment Jonah forgot how to breathe. "No French restaurant," she said finally. "There's a little Italian place in the village I love. Simple food, good wine, no pretense." "Done," he agreed immediately, fighting to keep the triumph from his voice. "Tomorrow night." "Tomorrow night," she nodded. Then, with a grace that seemed to define her every movement, she turned and walked away, leaving Jonah standing in the gathering dusk, already counting the hours until he would see her again. From his town car window that evening, he watched her emerge from the building, hailing a taxi with surprising authority for someone so petite. She was an enigma, a puzzle he couldn't solve, a story he couldn't put down. And for the first time since inheriting his father's empire, Jonah Vincent felt something dangerously close to hope. Chapter 3. The Fall. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed like a jewel against the Manhattan skyline, its grand steps lined with twinkling lights for the annual Publishing Industry Gala. Hazel Inessa stood before the mirror in the ladies' lounge, smoothing the silk of her burgundy gown. The dress had cost a month's salary, but tonight it was worth every penny. The deep color made her copper skin luminous, the delicate beading catching light with every movement. 3 weeks had passed since that first dinner with Jonah in the village. 3 weeks of stolen glances across conference rooms, late-night conversations about books that turned into discussions about life, and a growing awareness that made her heart race whenever he entered a room. They'd kept their dinners quiet, 4 more since that first night, but rumors were beginning to circulate through Crimson and Crown's hallways. "Miss Inessa," an assistant poked her head into the lounge. "Mr. Vincent is asking for you. The governor's about to arrive." Hazel took a deep breath, checking her reflection one final time. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, exposing the delicate diamond drops Jonah had sent to her apartment that morning. The note had read simply, "To match your brilliance." She found him at the top of the museum steps, cutting an impressive figure in his tuxedo. Something flickered in his steel-grey eyes when he saw her, something that made her pulse quicken. "You look..." Jonah trailed off, for once at a loss for words. "So do you," Hazel replied softly, accepting his offered arm. The museum's grand hall had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the city's literary elite, while string quartet music floated through the air. Hazel felt Jonah's hand settle at the small of her back as he guided her through the crowd. "Senator Mitchell wants to discuss our education initiative," he murmured close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "And the Times critic is hoping to get an exclusive on your rising star author." "All work tonight?" she asked, accepting a champagne flute from a passing waiter. "Never all work," he replied, and the heat in his voice made her shiver. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question, but Hazel had learned that with Jonah Vincent, the most important things rarely were. He led her to the dance floor just as the quartet began a waltz. His hand settled on her waist, pulling her closer than strictly necessary for polite society. "People are watching," she whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. "Let them," he answered, his thumb tracing small circles on her back through the silk of her dress. "I'm tired of pretending I don't want to look at you every time you enter a room." The candid admission made her breath catch. "Jonah, do you know what drives me crazy about you, Hazel?" His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "It's not just your beauty, though God knows you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. It's the way you see the world, the way you find magic in everyday things, the way you make me want to be better than I am." The waltz ended, but they continued swaying gently, lost in their own world. Hazel could feel the rapid beat of his heart where their bodies touched, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. "Come with me," he said suddenly, taking her hand. He led her away from the crowded hall, through corridors lined with priceless art, until they reached a small balcony overlooking the city. The October air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of approaching winter. Below them, Manhattan sparkled like a carpet of stars. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in his shadow," Jonah said quietly, staring out at the city. "My father built an empire from nothing, turned Crimson and Crown into a legend. How do you follow that?" Hazel turned to study his profile, seeing the vulnerability he kept so carefully hidden. "Then stop swimming against it," she suggested softly. "Create your own light." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Hazel felt the world tilt on its axis. "How do you do that?" he asked. "How do you see straight through every wall I put up?" "The same way I see the potential in every manuscript," she answered honestly. "I look for the story beneath the surface." Jonah's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And what story do you see in me?" "A man trying so hard to be what everyone expects that he's forgotten who he wants to be," Hazel whispered. "Someone brilliant and driven, but afraid to let anyone close enough to see his doubts. Someone who could change the world if he'd just believe in himself the way..." She hesitated. "The way you believe in me," he finished, stepping closer. The air between them crackled with electricity. Hazel could see the battle in his eyes, control versus desire, power versus vulnerability. She reached up, straightening his bow tie in a gesture that felt strangely intimate. "I believe in the man who spent 3 hours last week discussing 19th century literature with an aspiring author," she said. "The one who approved a children's literacy program without checking the ROI. The one who looks at me like that." "Like what?" His voice was hoarse. like I'm a story you can't wait to read." The last word had barely left her lips when Jonah closed the distance between them. His kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But when Hazel's hands slid up to tangle in his hair, something broke loose inside him. He backed her against the balcony railing, deepening the kiss until she felt it in every nerve ending. The world narrowed to sensation. The warmth of his body pressed against hers, the taste of champagne on his lips, the way his hands trembled slightly as they framed her face. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Hazel knew nothing would ever be the same. "I've wanted to do that since the first time you challenged me in my office," Jonah admitted, resting his forehead against hers. "Is that why you kept finding reasons to reject my proposals?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips. "To make me argue with you?" "You're magnificent when you're passionate about something," he said, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "Your eyes get this fire in them, and you forget to be quiet and proper. It's intoxicating." A burst of laughter from the party drifted out to their balcony, breaking the spell. Reality began to seep back in, their professional relationship, the company politics, the potential scandal. "This is complicated," Hazel said softly, though she made no move to leave his embrace. "Everything worth having is," Jonah replied. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her shiver. "I don't care about complicated. I care about you." "The board can go to hell," he interrupted. "I'm tired of living my life by other people's rules. You make me want to be brave, Hazel. Brave enough to admit that I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, too honest to take back, too powerful to ignore. Hazel felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the vulnerability in his confession. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of you, but of how much I feel for you. It's like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that jumping could either be flying or falling." "Then we'll find out together," Jonah said, pulling her close again, "because I'm standing on that same cliff, and I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Their second kiss was different from the first, slower, deeper, full of promise and possibility. The city lights twinkled below them, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll midnight. Like Cinderella at the ball, Hazel knew this magical moment couldn't last forever. Soon, they would have to return to the party, face the curious eyes and whispered speculation. But for now, in this perfect moment suspended between night and day, reality and dreams, she let herself believe in fairy tales. Jonah's arms were strong around her, his heart beating steadily against her cheek as she rested her head on his chest. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered into her hair. "Not for anything improper, just stay. Let me fall asleep knowing you're near." The request, so unlike his usual commanding tone, touched something deep in her soul. "Yes," she answered simply. Later, in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Hazel would change into one of his silk shirts, drowning in the fabric that smelled of him. They would talk until dawn, sharing secrets and dreams, fears and hopes. She would learn about the lonely boy who'd lost his mother too young, who'd never felt good enough for his father's legacy. He would discover the steel beneath her soft exterior, the ambition tempered by compassion that made her exceptional at her job. And in those quiet hours between night and morning, as the city slept around them, something profound would shift between them. The walls that had kept them apart, professional boundaries, social expectations, their own carefully constructed defenses, would crumble like sand castles before the tide. They were falling, both of them, into something deeper and more dangerous than either had expected. But as Hazel drifted to sleep in Jonah's arms, watching the first hints of dawn paint the sky in shades of possibility, she realized that sometimes falling felt exactly like flying. Morning would bring reality, with all its complications and consequences. But for now, In this suspended moment of grace, they were simply a man and a woman on the verge of something extraordinary. And like the best stories Hazel had ever edited, this one was just beginning. Chapter 4. Swift current November in New York painted the city in shades of amber and gold. But Hazel Inessa's world had never been more vibrant. 3 months into their relationship, every day with Jonah felt like stepping into a dream. The publishing world buzzed with speculation about their romance, but within the walls of Crimson and Crown, their professional dynamic remained impeccable. That morning, Hazel stood in Jonah's penthouse kitchen, wearing his dress shirt from the night before, watching dawn break over Central Park. The marble counter was cool beneath her bare feet as she waited for the coffee to brew. 3 months, and somehow this space had become more home than her own apartment. Warm arms encircled her waist from behind, and Jonah's lips found the sensitive spot beneath her ear. "You're up early," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "The Frankfurt Book Fair presentations need final review," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "And the quarterly numbers—" "Can wait," he finished, turning her to face him. His steel-grey eyes were soft with an emotion that still caught her breath. "Stay in bed with me. Let the world turn without us for a few hours." Hazel reached up to trace the line of his jaw, feeling the morning stubble beneath her fingers. The great Jonah Vincent, suggesting we neglect work? "Who are you and what have you done with my boyfriend?" "Boyfriend," he repeated, wrinkling his nose. "That word seems inadequate for what we are." "What would you prefer? Partner, lover, CEO of my heart?" He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her shiver. "How about husband?" The world stopped spinning. Hazel stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" Jonah stepped back, reaching into the pocket of his silk pajama pants. The vintage Tiffany ring box he withdrew made her knees weak. "I had this whole evening planned," he said, opening the box to reveal a stunning Art Deco diamond ring. "Dinner at Le Bernardin, champagne, violin players, the works. But watching you here in my kitchen wearing my shirt, I can't wait another moment." He sank to one knee on the heated marble floor, still holding the ring. "Hazel Inessa, you walked into my life and turned everything upside down. You make me want to be better, braver, more worthy of the way you look at me. Marry me, be my partner in everything. Life, love, literature. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Tears blurred Hazel's vision as she stared at the man before her. Powerful, brilliant Jonah Vincent, on his knees in his own kitchen, offering her his heart. "Your board will have opinions," she managed, her voice shaky. "Let them," he replied fiercely. "I love you. Everything else is details. The press can write whatever they want. I'm not asking them to marry me, I'm asking you." Hazel took a shuddering breath, overwhelmed by the intensity in his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jonah Vincent, I will marry you." The ring slid onto her finger like it had been made for her, which she realized it probably had been. Jonah stood, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of future and forever. The coffee maker beeped insistently, ignored. "I love you," she murmured against his lips. "But this is going to complicate everything." "Everything worth having is complicated," he reminded her, echoing his words from the gala. "We'll figure it out together." Later that morning, they walked into Crimson and Crown hand in hand. The vintage diamond on Hazel's finger caught the light, sending whispers rippling through the office like wind through wheat. Jonah's assistant took one look at them and immediately began cancelling his morning meetings. "Mr. Vincent," she called after them, "the board is requesting—" "Tell them I'll call in an hour," Jonah replied without stopping. "I have something more important to announce." He led Hazel to his office. Their office now, she supposed, and closed the door. The city sprawled below them, oblivious to the seismic shift in their world. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. To face the board? The press? The endless speculation about whether I slept my way to the top? She smiled up at him. Bring it on. I know who I am and what I've earned. Pride blazed in his eyes. That's my girl. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of announcements and congratulations. The board meeting was exactly as tense as they'd expected, but Jonah shut down every concern with the ruthless efficiency that had made him a publishing legend. Miss Inessa's professional record speaks for itself, he said coldly, when one board member suggested reassigning her to avoid impropriety. Her division's profits are up 40% year over year. Unless you're suggesting we prioritize outdated social conventions over shareholder value. Hazel sat beside him, quiet but unflinching. She'd earned her place in this room long before she'd fallen in love with Jonah Vincent. By evening, their engagement was front-page news on every publishing industry website. Hazel's phone buzzed constantly with messages from authors and colleagues. But it was the email from Richard Vincent's old assistant that made her cry. He would have been so happy, the message read. He always said you two would either kill each other or change the world together. I think he was hoping for the latter. They celebrated that night at the little Italian restaurant in the village where they'd had their first dinner. The owner himself brought them champagne, refusing to let them pay. To love, he toasted in heavily accented English, and to stories with happy endings. Jonah squeezed Hazel's hand under the table. The ending? We're just getting to the good part. But later that night, as they lay tangled in his silk sheets, the first shadow fell across their perfect moment. The Frankfurt Book Fair, Jonah said suddenly. You shouldn't go. Hazel propped herself up on an elbow, studying his face in the dim light. What? Why not? The timing isn't right. We just announced our engagement. There will be questions, speculation, and I need you here for the transition planning. Jonah, I've been working on the Frankfurt presentations for months. My authors are counting on me. Send Thompson, he can handle it. Thompson doesn't know these books like I do. He hasn't worked with the authors, built the relationships. Your career matters to me, Jonah interrupted, his voice taking on that familiar edge of command. That shouldn't threaten you. My career matters to me too, Hazel replied carefully. That's why I need to go to Frankfurt. He sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. The press will have a field day. Vincent's fiancée gallivanting around Europe while the company restructures. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection, she said softly. I need support. There's a difference. Something flickered in his eyes. Frustration, possession, fear. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I just got you. I don't want to share you with the world yet. You never have to share my heart, she promised, but my work, my dreams, those have to stay mine, Jonah. That's part of who I am, who you fell in love with. He was quiet for a long moment, his heartbeat steady against her cheek. You're right, he said finally. I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm afraid this is all too good to be true, that I'll wake up and you'll be gone. Hazel lifted her head, meeting his troubled gaze. Hey, she whispered, touching his face. I'm not going anywhere. This ring isn't just a pretty piece of jewelry. It's a promise. Whatever comes, we face it together. His kiss was fierce, almost desperate, as if he could bind her to him through sheer force of will. Hazel returned it with equal passion, trying to pour all her love and certainty into the connection. But later, watching him sleep, she couldn't shake the memory of that possessive edge in his voice. Jonah Vincent was used to controlling his world, bending reality to his will. Would he be able to let her maintain her independence within their marriage? Or would his love prove as demanding as his ambition? The diamond on her finger caught the moonlight, sending prisms dancing across the ceiling. It was beautiful, Perfect, exactly what she would have chosen for herself. But in that moment, it felt heavier than before. Morning found them tangled together again, the doubts of the night fading in the warm reality of his touch. Jonah was attentive, loving, eager to make up for his momentary lapse. He even suggested they fly to Frankfurt together, make it a working honeymoon of sorts. "See," he murmured, kissing her shoulder, "we can have it all. Career, love, future, everything." Hazel smiled, pushing away the lingering unease. They were just finding their balance, learning to merge their separate lives into one shared story. Every great romance had its moments of conflict. That's what made the resolution so satisfying. But as she dressed for work, carefully applying makeup to hide the shadows of a mostly sleepless night, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. In all the manuscripts she'd edited, all the love stories she'd shaped, she'd learned one universal truth. When something seems too perfect to be true, it usually is. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the warmth of Jonah's smile across the breakfast table, the way he kept reaching for her hand, as if to reassure himself she was real. They had love, trust, and a shared passion for bringing stories into the world. What could possibly go wrong? The answer to that question would come sooner than either of them expected, carried on the swift current of their own ambitions and fears. But for now, in the golden light of a New York morning, Hazel let herself believe in happy endings. Chapter 5. Thorn and Rose. The December wind whipped snow across Fifth Avenue as Hazel stood before the full-length mirror in the Plaza Hotel's bridal suite. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and vintage lace, its elegant simplicity a stark contrast to the extravagance surrounding her. Outside, New York's elite gathered in St. Patrick's Cathedral, waiting to witness the society wedding of the year. "5 minutes, Miss Inessa," the wedding planner called through the door. Soon she would be Mrs. Vincent, a transformation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The past month had been a whirlwind of preparations, most of which Jonah had insisted on controlling himself. The guest list had grown from their planned intimate ceremony to a who's who of publishing and Manhattan society. Every detail was perfect, precise, and utterly overwhelming. Hazel's phone buzzed on the vanity. A message from her newest author, whose manuscript was taking the industry by storm. "The early reviews are incredible," it read. "Thank you for believing in me." A smile touched her lips as she remembered the night she'd discovered that manuscript, working late in her office. Jonah had been angry she'd missed dinner, but the moment she'd started reading, she'd known it was worth it. Her instincts had been right. The book was now positioned to be the biggest debut of the year. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Are you ready, darling?" Jonah's voice carried through the door. "It's bad luck to see the bride before the wedding," she called back, smoothing her hands over the silk. "I make my own luck," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And I needed to see you." Before she could protest, the door opened. Jonah stood there in his tuxedo, looking devastatingly handsome and completely unapologetic. His eyes darkened as they took her in. "You're breathtaking," he whispered, crossing the room to her. "Jonah, the tradition." "To hell with tradition," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You're mine, and I couldn't wait another moment to tell you how beautiful you are." The possessive edge in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Pleasure or warning, she wasn't sure anymore. His kiss was gentle but claiming, careful not to smudge her makeup. "There's something else," he said, pulling back slightly. "A wedding present." He withdrew an envelope from his jacket pocket. Hazel opened it to find a contract, her promotion to executive editor, effective immediately. "Jonah," she began, uncertain. "You've earned it," he said quickly. "Your division's numbers are outstanding, and with the new merger—" "What merger?" A flash of annoyance crossed his face. It was supposed to be announced next week. We're acquiring Rivera Publishing. Their romance division will fall under your purview. That's Caroline's division, Hazel said slowly. She's been building it for 15 years. And now she'll report to you. It's a good move, Hazel, for the company and for us. Did you discuss this with the board? I don't need to discuss my management decisions with anyone, he replied, his tone cooling slightly. I'm CEO, and you're the most qualified person for the position. Because of my experience, or because I'm about to be your wife? Jonah's jaw tightened. Both. Is that so wrong? We're partners in everything now. Partners should discuss major decisions together, she said softly, especially ones that affect other people's careers. I'm trying to give you everything you've ever wanted, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. A bigger role, more responsibility, influence over the industry we both love. Why are you fighting this? Hazel looked down at the contract, then at her reflection in the mirror. The bride staring back at her seemed suddenly unfamiliar. Because I want to know that I earned it, she whispered. That when people look at me, they see more than just Jonah Vincent's wife. His expression softened. He turned her to face him, his hands warm on her shoulders. You've already proven yourself 1,000 times over. This promotion is recognition of your talent, not my influence. Take it, darling. Let me give you the world. The cathedral bells began to toll, signaling it was time. Hazel looked into Jonah's eyes, seeing the love there, the desperate desire to make her happy. She tucked the contract into her vanity drawer. Let's get married first, she said gently. We can discuss the promotion later. Something dark flickered across his face, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Whatever you want, my love, today is about us. The ceremony was everything a society wedding should be. Elegant, traditional, picture perfect. Hazel floated down the aisle on a cloud of ivory silk, her heart swelling at the sight of Jonah waiting for her at the altar. His vows were beautiful, promising to love, cherish, and support her dreams forever. But at the reception, she overheard whispers that made her blood run cold. Did you hear about Caroline? Forced into early retirement? The merger was his plan all along. Well, he had to make room for his new bride. Hazel found Jonah at the bar, accepting congratulations from a group of board members. Can we talk? She asked quietly. He excused himself, following her to a quiet corner. What's wrong, Mrs. Vincent? The name sent butterflies through her stomach, despite her unease. Caroline didn't retire voluntarily, did she? Jonah's expression hardened slightly. Business decisions aren't always pleasant, Hazel. The merger required restructuring. You could have told me. We could have found another way. There is no other way, he interrupted. This is business. Sometimes people get hurt, but you'll do amazing things with that division. Better than Caroline ever could. That's not the point, Hazel said, fighting to keep her voice steady. You manipulated the situation, forced her out to make room for me. I made a strategic decision that benefits everyone, he cut in, his tone turning cold. The company gets your talent in a bigger role. You get the promotion you deserve, and Caroline gets a generous retirement package. Why are you trying to turn our wedding day into a corporate ethics debate? Before she could respond, the wedding planner appeared. Mr. Vincent, it's time for your first dance. Jonah's smile returned instantly, the mask of the perfect groom sliding back into place. He held out his hand to Hazel. Shall we, my love? She took it, letting him lead her to the dance floor. As they swayed to their chosen song, The Way You Look Tonight, she tried to focus on the magic of the moment. This was her wedding day, the beginning of their life together. She loved this man, complicated as he was. But later that night in the honeymoon suite, she found herself staring at the city lights while Jonah slept. The promotion contract sat in her bag, unsigned, Her new wedding ring caught the light, beautiful and binding. "Everyone's talking about your success," Jonah had said at breakfast the next morning, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Our success," she'd corrected gently, reaching for his hand. "Your company, my edit, my company, my legacy." His grip had tightened on her fingers. "Know your place, Hazel." The words had hit her like a physical blow. She'd withdrawn her hand, studying her husband's face. Where was the man who'd knelt in his kitchen, promising to support her dreams? The one who'd said her independence was part of why he loved her? "I thought my place was by your side," she said quietly, "as your partner." "Of course it is," he replied, his tone softening. "But there has to be order, structure. The company comes first. You understand that, don't you?" She nodded slowly, but something had shifted between them. The fairy tale was developing cracks, hairline fractures in its perfect facade. That evening, she'd found a manila envelope on her desk. Inside was Caroline's resignation letter, dated 3 months earlier, before Jonah had even proposed. The careful orchestration of it all made her feel slightly ill. "I did it for us," Jonah said from the doorway, watching her read. "For your career, your future." "My future," Hazel repeated softly. "Or your plan for it." He crossed the room, turning her chair to face him. "Aren't they the same thing now? We're married, Hazel. Your success is my success. Your dreams are my dreams." "And what if my dreams don't match your plans?" Something dangerous flashed in his steel grey eyes. "Then we'll find a way to align them. That's what marriage is. Compromise, adaptation, growth." But as he kissed her, his lips demanding rather than asking, Hazel wondered if compromise in Jonah's world only went one way. The thought sent a chill down her spine, even as she melted into his embrace. The honeymoon in Bali was a dream of white sand beaches and candlelit dinners. Jonah was attentive, passionate, seemingly devoted to her happiness. But he checked his phone constantly, managed the office remotely, and grew tense whenever she mentioned work. "Let's focus on us," he'd say, taking her phone away. "The company can survive without you for a few weeks." But could she survive without the work that gave her purpose? The question haunted her, even as she tried to lose herself. In newlywed bliss, by the time they returned to New York, the merger was complete. Caroline's office had been cleared, her legacy reduced to a footnote in the company newsletter. Hazel's promotion was announced to appropriate applause, though she noticed some of her colleagues wouldn't meet her eyes. "They're jealous," Jonah said dismissively when she mentioned it. "Success always breeds resentment. Stop worrying about what other people think and focus on making me proud." Making him proud. The words echoed in her mind as she sat in her new, larger office, staring at the manuscript that had started it all. Her debut author's book was set to launch next week, positioned to be the biggest release of the season. But when she opened her calendar to check the publicity schedule, she found it had been completely rearranged. The intimate bookstore events she'd planned were replaced with high-profile media appearances and society functions. "The changes came from Mr. Vincent's office," her assistant explained nervously. "He said the original schedule wasn't befitting a Crimson and Crown major release." Hazel felt something inside her crack. This was her project, her author, her vision for the book's launch. She'd discovered this voice, nurtured it, believed in it when no one else had. And now, "Everyone's talking about your success." Jonah's words echoed in her mind. She looked down at her wedding ring, remembering his proposal in the kitchen, his promises of partnership and support. The diamond sparkled in the afternoon light, beautiful and sharp as a blade. Like a thorn hiding beneath a rose's perfect petals, the truth was beginning to draw blood. In Jonah Vincent's world, everything had its place, and hers was increasingly feeling like a gilded cage. Chapter 6. darkening skies. Spring came to Manhattan in a riot of cherry blossoms and fresh promises, but within the glass walls of Crimson and Crown Publishing, winter's chill lingered. 3 months into her marriage, Hazel Vincent sat in her executive office, staring at the email that had just appeared in her inbox. The subject line read, "Editorial Department Restructuring, effective immediately." She hadn't written it. She hadn't even known about it. The door opened without a knock, and Jonah strode in, impeccable in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. "Did you see the announcement? You're dismantling my team." Hazel's voice was barely above a whisper. "Without even discussing it with me?" "Restructuring," he corrected, settling into the chair across from her desk. "The Rivera merger created redundancies. This is just good business. Sarah has been with this company for 12 years. Marcus is our best developmental editor." "Was," Jonah interrupted. "Their positions have been eliminated. The severance packages are generous." "They're my team," Hazel said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I built this department, and now you'll build a better one." His tone softened slightly. "This is an opportunity, darling. Bring in your own people. Shape the department according to your vision." "My vision included the people you just fired." Steel crept into his voice. "Your vision needs to align with company objectives. You're an executive now, Hazel. Start thinking like one." "You mean start thinking like you?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jonah stood slowly, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision. "The board meeting is in an hour. I expect you to present a unified front on these changes." It wasn't a request. These days, nothing from Jonah was. The board meeting was a masterclass in corporate theater. Jonah presented the restructuring as a strategic optimization, all flowcharts and profit projections. When questions arose about the impact on ongoing projects, all eyes turned to Hazel. She felt Jonah's gaze boring into her, waiting. The weight of her wedding ring seemed to double. "The transitions will be seamless," she heard herself say, the words tasting like ash. "We've identified key personnel to maintain continuity on all major projects." Later in the elevator, Jonah pulled her close. "You did well," he murmured, kissing her temple. "I know it's difficult, but sometimes we have to make hard choices for the greater good." "The greater good," she repeated softly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" His grip on her waist tightened fractionally. "Don't start, Hazel. Not today." But the hits kept coming. That afternoon, she discovered her author events calendar had been completely reorganized. Again. Her carefully planned intimate bookstore readings replaced with high society cocktail parties and charity galas. The changes came from Mr. Vincent's office. Her new assistant explained nervously. The old one had been reassigned last week. That evening, they attended a publishing industry gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Hazel wore a midnight blue gown that made her copper skin glow, but she felt cold inside. Jonah kept her close, his hand possessive at the small of her back as they worked the room. "The Vincent power couple," someone commented. "Publishing's new dynasty." Dynasty. The word echoed in her mind as she watched Jonah charm potential investors. Was that all she was now? Part of his carefully constructed empire? The breaking point came during his speech. He was announcing Crimson and Crown's new digital initiative, a project Hazel had conceptualized months ago before their marriage. "Innovation is in our DNA," Jonah declared to the assembled crowd. "Which is why I'm proud to announce our new digital-first imprint, Crown Digital." Hazel felt the blood drain from her face. She'd named it Crimson Unlimited. The business plan on her desk still bore that title. "This revolutionary approach to publishing," Jonah continued, "will transform how we discover and develop new talent." Her vision, her project, even some of her exact words from the proposal she'd written. But now, It was all his. "You're part of the company," he'd said when she confronted him later that night. "Your ideas are company assets. Why does it matter whose name is on them?" "Because I'm not just an asset, Jonah. I'm supposed to be your partner." "You embarrassed me in front of the board," he said coldly, loosening his bow tie. "Questioning me like that in public. By doing my job?" Her voice shook with suppressed emotion. "By overshadowing me." The words exploded from him. "In my own company. Every conversation tonight, 'Oh, Hazel's so brilliant, Hazel's so innovative.' Do you have any idea how that makes me look? Like a successful CEO with a talented executive team?" His laugh was bitter. "Like a man who can't control his own wife." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Hazel stared at her husband, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "Control? I want respect," he snapped. "I want my wife to understand her place in this organization, in this marriage." "And what place is that exactly?" He crossed the room in 2 strides, gripping her arms. "By my side, supporting me, not competing with me. Is that so difficult to understand?" "You're hurting me," she said softly. He released her immediately, stepping back as if burned. Horror flickered across his face, quickly replaced by cold composure. "I'm sorry," he said stiffly. "I shouldn't have. This conversation is over." But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few weeks brought more changes. Her office was moved, to be closer to his, he claimed. Her team meetings required his presence. Her emails were monitored for quality control. "He's just protective," her new assistant suggested timidly. "He wants you to succeed." But success, Hazel was learning, had a very specific definition in Jonah's world. It meant agreeing with him, deferring to him, becoming a reflection of his vision rather than a person with her own. The final straw came at the quarterly shareholders' meeting. Hazel was presenting the performance of her division, strong numbers despite the turbulent restructuring. She'd just begun outlining their upcoming releases when Jonah interrupted. "What my wife means to say," he cut in smoothly, "is that we're realigning our acquisition strategy to focus on more commercial properties." "Actually," Hazel said clearly, "our data shows that our literary fiction line is outperforming industry standards." "Numbers can be misleading," Jonah interrupted again, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Trust me, I know what's best for this company." The room fell silent. Every eye darted between them, watching the power play unfold. "Do you?" Hazel asked softly. "Or do you just think you know what's best for everyone?" The silence turned arctic. Jonah's smile became a frozen thing. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess," he suggested, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Vincent and I need to discuss some details privately." In his office, the mask fell away completely. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded, "challenging me like that in front of the shareholders?" "I was doing my job," Hazel replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Presenting accurate data. Your job is to support me, to present a unified front. Instead, you're undermining my authority at every turn." "Your authority?" She gave a hollow laugh. "Is that all you care about? Your power? Your control?" "Don't be dramatic," he sneered. "This isn't about control, it's about respect." "Respect goes both ways, Jonah. When was the last time you showed any respect for my judgment, my expertise, the career I built before I ever met you? The career I've enhanced," he shouted. "Everything you have now, the position, the influence, the success, it's all because of me." The words hit her like physical blows, but Hazel stood her ground. "Is that what you really think? That I'm nothing without you?" "You're my wife," he said, as if that explained everything. "Everything you do reflects on me. Every success, every failure, It all comes back to me. Why can't you understand that? Standing there in his perfectly appointed office, surrounded by the trappings of his power, Hazel finally understood with perfect clarity. She wasn't his partner. She was his possession. I understand perfectly, she said quietly. I understand that I've been so busy trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect executive, that I've forgotten who I am. But thank you, Jonah. You've just reminded me. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Where do you think you're going? We're in the middle of a meeting. No, she replied, not turning around. You're in the middle of a meeting. I'm in the middle of waking up. She walked out, leaving him calling after her. In her office, she began gathering her personal items, her hands shaking but her mind clear. The sky outside was darkening with an approaching storm, but for the first time in months, Hazel felt light. The cage door had finally swung open. All she had to do was find the courage to fly. Chapter 7. Breaking point thunder rolled across Manhattan as Hazel stood in the penthouse master bedroom, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. Designer dress, perfect makeup, hollow eyes. 6 months of marriage had transformed her into something polished and proper, a perfect corporate wife. But underneath the glossy surface, cracks were spreading like spider webs through glass. The door slammed downstairs, making her flinch. Jonah was home early. Hazel? His voice carried up the spiral staircase, sharp with anger. We need to talk, now. She took a deep breath, smoothing her hands down her silk dress. After the shareholders' meeting, she'd gone straight to her lawyer, not the family firm Jonah had chosen, but a woman recommended by her old assistant. The papers in her desk drawer felt like live ammunition. There you are. Jonah appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, hair disheveled. Do you have any idea what your little stunt today cost us? 3 board members called. How was your lunch with Monica Thane? Hazel interrupted quietly. He faltered for a fraction of a second. What? Monica Thane. The new junior editor you hired last week. The one you had a 3-hour lunch with at Le Bernardin today. It was a business lunch, he said dismissively. Discussing the new digital imprint? The one you stole from me? Hazel turned to face him fully. Or was she sharing her ideas about that too, between martinis? Color flooded his face. Are you spying on me? No need. Manhattan's publishing circle is smaller than you think. People talk, Jonah, about your long lunches, your private meetings, your special interest in certain female employees. You're being ridiculous, he snapped. I'm the CEO. I have meetings. You're my husband. Hazel cut in, her voice breaking slightly. You promised to be my partner, my equal. Instead, you've spent 6 months systematically dismantling everything I've built. Everything you've built? He gave a harsh laugh. Look around you, Hazel. The position, the office, this penthouse, I gave you everything. No, she said softly. You gave me a cage, a beautiful, expensive cage, but a cage nonetheless. And then you started clipping my wings, one feather at a time. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face. For a moment, she saw something vulnerable there, the boy who'd lost his mother too young, who'd never felt good enough for his father's legacy. But then, the mask slammed back into place. You're being hysterical, he said coldly. This is about the shareholders' meeting, isn't it? Your pride is hurt because I corrected you in public. This is about every meeting, Hazel replied. Every decision you've made without consulting me. Every time you've undermined my authority, dismissed my ideas, treated me like an asset instead of a partner. I treat you like my wife. No, you treat me like your property. The words exploded from her, months of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. You rearrange my schedule without asking, monitor my emails, isolate me from my colleagues. You fired everyone who was loyal to me and replaced them with people who report directly to you. I'm protecting you, he growled. This industry is cutthroat. People would use you to get to me. Use me? Hazel gave a bitter laugh. The way you used me to take over Rivera Publishing. The way you used our marriage to force out Caroline and anyone else who might challenge your authority. Jonah crossed the room in 3 strides, gripping her arms. Everything I've done has been for us, for our future. Let go of me. Her voice was steel. He released her immediately, stepping back. Horror flickered across his face, quickly replaced by cold control. You're upset, he said, straightening his tie. We'll discuss this later when you're thinking rationally. No, Hazel said quietly. We'll discuss it now. I want a divorce. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Jonah went completely still. What did you say? I want a divorce. She moved to her desk, withdrawing the papers her lawyer had prepared. I've already signed my copy. He stared at the documents as if they were written in alien script. This is absurd. You're my wife. We're building an empire together. No, you're building an empire. I'm just another acquisition. Don't be dramatic, he sneered. Where would you even go? Everything you have is because of me. Hazel felt an odd sense of calm settle over her. That's where you're wrong. I had a career before you, Jonah, a reputation, skills that I earned through hard work, not marriage, and I'll have them after you, too. After me, he gave a harsh laugh. You think anyone in this industry will touch you after you leave me? I made you, Hazel. I can break you just as easily. There it is, she said softly. The real Jonah Vincent. Not the charming CEO, not the devoted husband. Just a scared little boy so desperate for control, he has to break everything he claims to love. The slap happened so fast, she didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, cheek burning. In the ringing silence that followed, thunder cracked overhead. Jonah stared at his hand in horror. Hazel, I didn't mean... Get out of my house, she whispered. Your house. His voice turned ugly. Nothing here is yours. You're nothing without me. Get out. Maybe it was the ice in her voice, or the way she stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from steel. Whatever the reason, Jonah took a step back. You'll regret this, he said, but his voice shook slightly. Everything you have, everything you are, is mine, she finished. My talent, my strength, my choice to walk away. She turned her back on him, a dismissal that cut deeper than any words. Behind her, she heard him storm out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. Only then did she allow herself to shake, pressing a cold hand to her burning cheek. Tears threatened, but she held them back. She'd cried enough in this marriage. Moving with deliberate calm, she went to her closet. Behind the designer dresses and power suits, she found the overnight bag she'd packed that morning. Basic clothes, important documents, her grandmother's pearls. Everything that mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. Safe house is ready. Car waiting downstairs. Hazel took one last look around the penthouse she'd called home. Every perfect, expensive inch of it screamed Jonah's control. The art he'd chosen, the furniture he'd selected, the life he'd designed, without ever asking what she wanted. In their bedroom, her wedding ring caught the light from another lightning flash. She slipped it off, placing it on his pillow. The indent it left on her finger would fade, like all the other marks he'd made. The storm was breaking over Manhattan as she stepped into the waiting car, but Hazel felt nothing but peace. Sometimes, she realized, you had to walk through darkness to find your own light. Where to? The driver asked. Hazel thought of the little brownstone in the village where she'd lived before Jonah, the life she'd built on her own terms. She'd given it up for his dream of perfection, but maybe it wasn't too late to build something new. Freedom, she said softly. Then, more practically, the Plaza Hotel, please. As the car pulled away from the curb, her phone erupted with messages. Jonah switching between threats and pleas. Board members expressing concern. Society friends choosing sides. She turned off the phone, watching rain wash the city clean. Tomorrow would bring challenges, legal battles, professional consequences, the whispers and judgments of Manhattan's elite. But for now, in this moment between what was and what could be, Hazel felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The storm raged on, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. She'd survived her own personal tempest and emerged stronger. Let Jonah keep his empire of glass and steel. She was building something stronger, a life that was truly her own. Chapter 8. Flight. The Plaza Hotel's executive suite felt like a fortress high above Manhattan, but Hazel knew it was only temporary sanctuary. Through the rain-streaked windows, she could see Crimson and Crown's tower looming in the distance, its lights burning despite the late hour. Somewhere in that glass fortress, Jonah would be plotting his next move. Her phone lay silent on the antique desk, powered off to stem the flood of messages. Instead, she focused on her laptop, methodically executing the escape plan she'd been crafting for weeks. Email accounts secured, bank accounts separated, private documents retrieved from their cloud storage. A knock at the door made her freeze. "Room service, Mrs. Vincent." She relaxed slightly. "Please leave it outside." "There's also a package for you, ma'am. Requires a signature." Hazel approached the door cautiously, checking the security peephole. A uniformed hotel staff member stood alone in the hallway, holding a silver dinner tray and a small envelope. She opened the door just enough to sign for the package, then quickly closed and double-bolted it. The envelope contained a single key and a handwritten note from her lawyer. "Safe house ready. 221 Green Street. Private entrance through the bookshop." A smile touched her lips. Of course, Sarah would find her a refuge surrounded by books. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Hazel dressed carefully in clothes she'd had delivered from a department store. Simple black pants, cream silk blouse, low heels. Professional, but unremarkable. The designer wardrobe she'd worn as Mrs. Vincent remained in the penthouse, along with everything else he'd given her. Her new phone buzzed, a secure line, number known only to her lawyer and a handful of trusted allies. "He's making moves," Sarah reported without preamble. "Called an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. Hazel glanced at her watch. 7:30. Time to go. The town car her lawyer had arranged waited in the plaza's private garage. As they merged into Manhattan traffic, Hazel allowed herself one look back at the life she was leaving. 6 months of marriage, of compromise and silence, of watching herself disappear piece by piece into Jonah's perfect vision. Never again. The safe house was perfect. A pre-war brownstone in the village, its ground floor occupied by a charming independent bookstore. The private entrance led to a second-floor apartment that smelled of old paper and possibility. Previous owner was a professor, Sarah explained when she stopped by with supplies. Left everything furnished when she moved to Paris. It's yours as long as you need it. Hazel wandered the rooms, trailing fingers along book-lined walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a tiny courtyard garden. The kitchen was small but efficient. The bedroom cozy with its iron-frame bed and handmade quilts. "What's happening at the office?" she asked finally. Sarah's expression darkened. "Jonah's on a rampage. Fired 3 people this morning, including your entire PR team. He's telling everyone you had a nervous breakdown." "Of course he is," Hazel said softly. "Can't admit his perfect wife simply walked away." "The board meeting was ugly. He tried to force through emotion to have you removed from your position, citing personal instability. Regina Bradford shut him down hard." Hazel smiled slightly. The board's senior member had always seen through Jonah's charm. "I need you to do something for me," she said, reaching for her laptop. Send this email to everyone in editorial. Sarah read the message. Hazel's formal resignation as executive editor, effective immediately. Are you sure? You've earned that position. I earned everything I had before Jonah, Hazel interrupted gently. I can earn it all again, on my own terms this time. The next few days passed in a blur of legal meetings and careful planning. Hazel's lawyer was building a strong case, documenting every instance of professional and personal manipulation. The bruise on her cheek had faded, but the photographs were damning. A week after her escape, Hazel finally felt steady enough to venture out. The Literary Society was hosting a panel discussion on the future of publishing, and she knew it was time to show the industry she wasn't hiding. The event was at the New York Public Library, its marble halls filled with familiar faces. Whispers followed her entrance, but Hazel held her head high. Her simple black dress was a far cry from the designer labels she'd worn as Mrs. Vincent, but she'd never felt more herself. Quite an entrance, a deep voice commented as she found her seat, though I suspect you're used to those. Hazel turned to find herself looking into the warmest brown eyes she'd ever seen. The man beside her radiated a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with his perfectly tailored suit. Stanley Sullivan, he introduced himself, Chief Executive Officer of Secure Flow Systems. Hazel Inessa, she replied deliberately, reclaiming her own name. I know, he smiled. Your reputation precedes you. The editor who turned an unknown author into this year's literary sensation. You follow publishing news. I follow success stories, he said simply, especially ones that challenge the status quo. Before she could respond, the panel began. But throughout the discussion, Hazel was acutely aware of Stanley's presence beside her. He asked intelligent questions, challenged conventional wisdom, and displayed a genuine passion for literature that surprised her. Join me for coffee? He asked when the panel ended. There's a quiet place around the corner. Hazel hesitated. Her instincts for self-preservation had been hard-won. Just coffee, Stanley added, as if reading her thoughts. In public, no pressure. The cafe was indeed quiet, tucked away from the library's tourist crowds. Stanley ordered plain black coffee and listened intently as Hazel found herself sharing her love of discovering new voices in literature. You light up when you talk about books, he observed. It's not just business for you, is it? Books saved me, she admitted. Growing up, they showed me worlds beyond my small town, possibilities I never dreamed existed. And now you help others find their voice. His smile was gentle. That's a rare gift. One I'm not sure I'll be able to use anymore, she said softly. The industry is complicated. Because of your marriage? Stanley's directness was refreshing after months of careful evasion. I won't pretend I haven't heard the rumors, but I've also heard about your work, your integrity, your talent for spotting diamonds in the rough. Why do I sense you're leading somewhere with this? He leaned back, studying her thoughtfully. Secure Flow is launching a digital publishing platform, not just ebooks, a whole new ecosystem for writers to develop their craft, find their audience, maintain creative control. We need someone who understands both the traditional industry and the need for innovation. Hazel's mind raced with possibilities. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity, Stanley corrected, to build something new, something that could change the industry. No strings, no corporate politics, just your vision and our resources. Why me? Because you see potential where others see risk. Because you understand that stories matter more than spreadsheets. He paused, then added quietly, and because you've proven you have the courage to walk away from a toxic situation and start over. A movement by the window caught Hazel's eye. A black town car idled across the street, Jonah's driver. The message was clear. She was being watched. "You don't have to answer now," Stanley said, following her gaze. "Take time to think it through. We can—" "Yes," Hazel interrupted. In that moment, watching Jonah's surveillance, something crystallized inside her. Yes to the job. Yes to starting over. Stanley's smile was warm but professional. "I'm glad. But you should know something. I've been exactly where you are. My first marriage ended badly. I know what it's like to rebuild while everyone's watching, judging, waiting for you to fail. Is that why you're helping me? I'm helping you because you deserve the chance to prove what you can do on your own terms." He withdrew a business card, sliding it across the table. "Take the weekend to review the contract. My private number's on the back if you need anything. And Hazel?" She looked up from the card. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. "I saw you flinch when the waiter moved too quickly, but you don't have to live in fear either." Tears pricked at her eyes, but Hazel blinked them back. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside the cafe, Stanley's driver waited with an unmarked car. "Let us drop you somewhere safe," he offered. As they pulled away from the curb, Hazel caught a glimpse of Jonah's driver speaking urgently into a phone. Let him report back. Let Jonah know she wasn't hiding, wasn't broken, wasn't his to control anymore. "Your former husband is a powerful man," Stanley commented as they drove. "But power based on fear and control is inherently fragile. Remember that." Hazel studied his profile, seeing only calm strength and genuine concern. No agenda, no manipulation, no need to dominate. "Will you tell me about your first marriage someday?" she asked. "Someday," he agreed. "When you're ready to hear it and I'm ready to tell it. For now, let's focus on your fresh start." They dropped her 2 blocks from the safe house. Before she got out, Stanley touched her hand lightly. "You're stronger than you know," he said simply. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that again." Watching the car pull away, Hazel felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Not attraction. It was far too soon for that. Not even hope, exactly. Freedom. The power of being seen for herself, not as someone's wife or possession. In her apartment above the bookstore, she opened her laptop and began to write. Not a resignation letter this time, but a manifesto for the future of publishing. Digital platforms, democratized access, support for emerging voices, everything she'd dreamed of doing before Jonah had twisted her vision into his. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dinner next week? Strictly professional, minus SS." Hazel smiled, saving the number under new chapter. Outside her window, twilight painted Manhattan in shades of possibility. She was done living in shadows, done being afraid. It was time to spread her wings and fly. Chapter 9. Liberation. The September sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Secure Flow Systems' Manhattan headquarters, casting warm light across Hazel's new office. Unlike the coldly elegant space she'd occupied at Crimson and Crown, this room felt alive with possibility. Whiteboards covered in project notes lined one wall, while her beloved books filled custom-built shelves along another. A vintage reading chair occupied one corner, perfect for reviewing manuscripts. 3 months had passed since her escape from Jonah's penthouse. 3 months of rebuilding, of rediscovering her voice, of learning to trust her instincts again. The bruise on her cheek had faded, but other marks lingered, invisible but slowly healing. "The development team is ready for you," her assistant announced, "and Mr. Sullivan asked if you could stop by his office afterward." Hazel smiled, gathering her presentation materials. Stanley had been true to his word, giving her complete creative control over Secure Flow's publishing platform. No micromanagement, no hidden agendas, just respect for her expertise and genuine excitement for her vision. The meeting went brilliantly. The developers caught her enthusiasm for creating tools that would help new writers grow while maintaining the rigorous standards she'd always championed. This wasn't just about publishing books. It was about nurturing voices that might otherwise never be heard. "Impressive work," Stanley said afterward, leaning against his office doorframe. "The team's energized." "They should be," Hazel replied, following him into the sunny corner office. "We're building something revolutionary." "You're building it," he corrected, gesturing for her to sit. "I just provided the canvas." 3 months of working closely together had taught Hazel to read Stanley's expressions. Something was on his mind. "What's wrong?" He sighed, sliding a newspaper across his desk. The headline made her blood freeze. "Vincent Publishing Empire in Crisis. CEO's personal life affects stock value." "Jonah's trying to block the divorce," she said quietly, "using company resources to fight it." "I know," Stanley replied. "My lawyers intercepted some interesting documents. He's been monitoring your emails, having you followed." "I'm not surprised." Hazel's hands trembled slightly. "Control is everything to him." "We can protect you," Stanley said firmly. "SecureFlow's cybersecurity is unmatched, and I've hired additional security for the building. I won't let him make me live in fear." "Good." His smile was warm. "Because these arrived this morning." He handed her a thick envelope. Inside, Hazel found documents that made her heart race. Evidence of Jonah's financial manipulation, emails proving how he'd orchestrated Caroline's removal, surveillance reports he'd commissioned. "How did you get these?" "Let's just say some of his employees have long memories and strong moral compasses." Stanley's expression hardened slightly. "He's not the only one with resources, Hazel. The difference is, I use mine to protect people, not control them." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you deserve to be free. Because your talent shouldn't be buried under his ego. And because..." He hesitated. "Because I see in you the same fire I had to rediscover after my own divorce. The determination to rebuild, to prove that survival isn't the same as letting them win." A knock interrupted them. Stanley's assistant entered with another envelope, this one bearing the court seal. "It's time," Hazel whispered, recognizing the divorce papers she'd been waiting for. "Do you want privacy?" She shook her head. "Stay, please." With steady hands, she opened the envelope. The legal language was cold and clear. Division of assets, dissolution of marriage, restoration of her maiden name. Everything she'd fought for these past months distilled into formal paragraphs and signature lines. "He'll be getting his copy now," she said, reaching for a pen. "Are you ready for his reaction?" Hazel's signature flowed across the page, bold and unhesitating. "I'm not afraid anymore." As if on cue, her phone buzzed with Jonah's number. She let it go to voicemail. "Have dinner with me," Stanley said suddenly. Hazel looked up, startled. "What?" "Not a date," he clarified quickly, "just celebration of your freedom, of new beginnings." She studied him thoughtfully. Stanley Sullivan was everything Jonah wasn't: steady, genuine, respectful of boundaries. Over the past months, she'd felt something growing between them, carefully banked but undeniable. "Not a date," she agreed, "but maybe a start?" His smile was worth everything. "I know a quiet Italian place in the village." "I think I know it too." The restaurant was exactly as she remembered, but this time there was no power play, no hidden agenda, just good food, better conversation, and the sense of possibility in the air. "Tell me about your first marriage," Hazel said over tiramisu. "You promised you would someday." Stanley was quiet for a moment, swirling wine in his glass. "I was young, ambitious, desperate to prove myself. Alexandra was from old money, connected to every tech giant in Silicon Valley. I thought marriage would give me legitimacy, access, power." "What happened?" I became someone I didn't recognize, cutting deals instead of creating solutions, focusing on appearances instead of innovation. Alexandra wasn't evil. She was just playing the game she'd been raised to play, but it was destroying everything I dreamed of building. How did you find the strength to leave? Rock bottom, he admitted. Lost a major contract because I was too busy maintaining our social position to see the project was flawed. That night, looking in the mirror, I didn't know who I was anymore. Hazel reached across the table, squeezing his hand. But you found yourself again. Built myself again, he corrected. From scratch. Founded Secure Flow with a different mission, using technology to empower people, not control them. It wasn't easy, but it was worth every battle. Like this publishing platform? Exactly. His eyes lit up. Giving voices to people who might never get past traditional gatekeepers, creating communities where talent can grow. It's not just business, it's revolution. Revolution, Hazel repeated softly. I like that. They walked through Washington Square Park afterward, the autumn air crisp with promise. Street musicians played jazz and couples danced under the arch. Dance with me? Stanley asked. Hazel hesitated. The last time she danced had been her wedding. Just friends, he reminded her. No pressure, no expectations. His hand was warm and steady as he led her in a simple swing step. No possessive grip, no power play, just the joy of movement and music. Back at her apartment above the bookstore, Hazel found an email waiting from her lawyer. Jonah had received the divorce papers. His reaction had been exactly as expected. Rage, threats, attempts to freeze her assets. But attached to the email were more documents, proof of his manipulation, testimony from former employees, evidence that would destroy him if made public. Your choice, her lawyer wrote. We can fight fire with fire, or we can take the high road. Hazel thought of Stanley's story, of rebuilding without revenge, of rising above the game instead of playing it. Her reply was simple. High road. I don't need to destroy him. I just need to be free. Later that night, she stood at her window, watching the city lights twinkle. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stanley. Proud of you! Tomorrow's a new day! Yes, she thought, touching the place where her wedding ring used to sit. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in too long, she was truly ready to embrace it. The divorce papers sat on her desk, her signature bold and clear. Soon they would be filed, making official what she'd known in her heart for months. She was no longer Jonah Vincent's wife, his possession, his carefully curated corporate asset. She was simply Hazel Inessa, strong enough to fly, wise enough to wait for real love, and finally, beautifully, completely free. Chapter 10, Phoenix Rising. The New York Times headline blazed across Manhattan newsstands. Digital revolution in publishing, Secure Flow's new platform changes the game. Beneath it, a photo showed Hazel at the launch event, radiant in a simple blue dress, describing her vision for democratizing literature. 6 months after walking away from Crimson and Crown, she had created something entirely her own. Stanley found her in the office early that morning, surrounded by congratulatory flowers and messages from authors already finding success on the platform. The board is ecstatic, he said, leaning against her doorframe. Sign-ups are triple our projections. It's not about numbers, Hazel replied, but her eyes sparkled. Read this message from a single mother in Ohio. Her manuscript was rejected by 12 publishers, but she found her audience here, 10,000 readers in 2 weeks. Because you built a system that values voice over connections. Stanley crossed the room, perching on the edge of her desk. You're changing lives, Hazel. Their eyes met, and that now familiar warmth bloomed in her chest. Over the past months, their friendship had deepened into something more, though neither had rushed to define it. Stanley respected her need to heal, to find herself again before opening her heart. But lately, the careful distance between them felt more like habit than necessity. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said softly. "Not as friends, not as colleagues, as us." Hazel's heart skipped. "Stanley, I know you're not ready for complicated, but this doesn't have to be. Just dinner, just us, just real." Before she could respond, her assistant appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Inessa, there's a situation in the lobby." Hazel knew before she reached the security desk. Jonah stood in the marble foyer, immaculate in a bespoke suit, radiating cold fury. "You can't ignore me forever," he called, as security blocked his path. "Watch me," she replied calmly, turning away. "The platform is stealing our authors," his voice echoed through the lobby. "You're destroying everything we built." Now Hazel turned back, anger flaring. "We didn't build anything, Jonah. You took what I built and claimed it as yours, just like you tried to take me." "Is this about him?" Jonah sneered, gesturing at Stanley, who had appeared silently beside her. "Trading up to a bigger empire?" "No," Hazel said quietly. "This is about me, my vision, my talent, everything you tried to control but never could." "I made you who you are," Jonah shouted across the lobby. "You tried to make me who you wanted me to be," she corrected. "There's a difference." She felt Stanley's presence behind her, solid and steady, but he remained silent. This was her battle. "Security will escort you out," she told Jonah. "Don't come back." In her office, her hands shook slightly as she sank into her chair. Stanley closed the door, giving her space to breathe. "I've never seen you more magnificent," he said finally. A surprised laugh escaped her. "Magnificent? I'm terrified." "That's what makes it magnificent." He knelt beside her chair. "You're scared but standing your ground. That's real courage." Hazel studied his face. The warmth in his brown eyes, the gentle strength in his expression, no manipulation, no power play, just honest admiration. "Yes," she said suddenly, "yes. To dinner, to us, to whatever comes next." His smile could have lit up Manhattan. "I know a place in the village." "No," Hazel interrupted. "I want to cook for you. At my place." The significance wasn't lost on him. She'd never invited anyone to her sanctuary above the bookstore. That evening, Hazel moved around her small kitchen with growing confidence, preparing her grandmother's pasta recipe. Stanley sat at her counter, chopping vegetables and sharing stories about his early days in tech. "The first company I built failed spectacularly," he admitted. "Lost everything except my belief that technology should serve people, not control them." "Is that why Secure Flow focuses on empowerment?" "Partly, but mostly because I learned that true success isn't about power over others. It's about giving people power over their own stories." Hazel paused, wooden spoon hovering over the sauce. "That's it exactly. What we're building with the platform, it's not just about publishing books, it's about letting people own their narratives. Like you're owning yours." She turned to face him. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have," he said firmly. "I just provided the tools. The strength was always yours. The pasta was perfect, the wine excellent, but what Hazel remembered most was the easy flow of conversation. They talked about books, technology, dreams for the future, no power plays, no hidden agendas. After dinner, they stood at her window, watching the city lights twinkle. Stanley's hand found hers, warm and steady. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I have been for months, but I needed you to be ready to hear it." Hazel's heart raced, but not with fear. "How did you know I was ready?" "Because today, facing Jonah, you weren't fighting him anymore. You were simply being yourself. Magnificent, remember?" She turned to face him, still holding his hand. I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me because last time love became a cage. Yes. Stanley lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Then we'll build something different. No cages, no ownership, no control. Just partnership, respect, and all the time you need. I don't need more time, Hazel whispered, and rose on tiptoes to kiss him. It was nothing like kissing Jonah. No desperate passion, no need to dominate. Stanley's kiss was gentle but sure, an offering rather than a demand. When they parted, both were smiling. "Stay," she said softly. "Not for anything else, just stay." They fell asleep on her couch, talking until dawn, her head on his chest, his arms warm around her. For the first time since leaving Jonah, Hazel felt completely safe. The next morning, the publishing world exploded with news of Crimson and Crown's latest crisis. 3 major authors had jumped ship to Secure Flow's platform, citing creative control and better terms. Jonah's leadership was being questioned by the board. "He's reaping what he sowed," Stanley commented over coffee. "Building an empire on fear only works until people stop being afraid." Hazel watched him move around her kitchen, so at ease in her space. "I want to help his authors," she said suddenly. "The ones he's been controlling, manipulating, they deserve better. Then let's build it for them." Stanley's eyes lit up with shared purpose. "A migration program, special support for established authors transitioning to digital." They spent the morning brainstorming, their professional synergy as natural as their personal connection. By lunch, they had a full proposal ready for the board. "You know this will drive him crazy," Stanley said, as they reviewed the final draft, offering sanctuary to his authors. "I'm not doing it to hurt him," Hazel replied. "I'm doing it because it's right." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead. "That's why it will work. You're building from love, not revenge." Later that week, they launched the Author Liberation Initiative. The response was overwhelming, not just from Crimson and Crown's authors, but from writers across the industry trapped in restrictive contracts. Watching the sign-up numbers soar, Hazel felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd always dreamed of, using her talent to help others find their voice. Not for profit or power, but for the pure joy of stories set free. "Magnificent," Stanley whispered, holding her close as they celebrated in her office. "Absolutely magnificent." And she was. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes of her marriage, Hazel had emerged stronger, wiser, ready to soar. But this time she wasn't flying alone. This time she had someone who loved her strength instead of fearing it. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. And Hazel Inessa, finally free to be herself, couldn't wait to see what stories it would hold. Chapter 11. Full Circle. The Metropolitan Museum of Art glowed against the spring twilight, its grand steps lined with lanterns for Secure Flow's charity gala. 1 year had passed since Hazel had left Jonah's world of glass and steel. Now she stood in the same marble halls where their story had begun, but everything was different. The emerald ring on her finger caught the light as she adjusted the silk of her midnight blue gown. Stanley had proposed 3 days ago, not with grand gestures or public displays, but with quiet certainty in the garden of their favorite Italian restaurant. "Not because I want to own you," he'd said, holding out the vintage ring, "but because I want to walk beside you, build with you, grow with you, partners in everything, always." The press had caught wind of their engagement immediately. Technology mogul and publishing innovator, it made for irresistible headlines. But what the papers couldn't capture was the depth of their connection, built on mutual respect and shared vision. "There you are." Stanley's voice pulled her from her memories. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but it was the warmth in his eyes that made her heart race. Ready to face the wolves. The gala was doubling as their unofficial engagement celebration. Manhattan's elite had turned out in force, curious to see the woman who had not only survived Jonah Vincent's world, but built something greater of her own. "Ms. Inessa," reporters called as they descended the museum steps. "How does it feel to be engaged again so soon?" SecureFlow's platform has revolutionized publishing. Any comment on Crimson and Crown's declining market share? Hazel handled their questions with grace, Stanley's hand steady at the small of her back. Inside, the museum's grand hall had been transformed into a wonderland of books and technology. Tablets displayed works from SecureFlow's newest authors, while traditional books filled artistic displays. "This is incredible," Regina Bradford, now retired from Crimson and Crown's board, embraced Hazel warmly. "You've created something remarkable here." "We all did," Hazel corrected, smiling at Stanley. "It takes a team to build a revolution." The evening flowed like champagne, full of congratulations and genuine celebration. Authors who had found their voice through SecureFlow's platform shared success stories. Tech innovators praised the platform's elegant design. Even Hazel's former assistant from Crimson and Crown, now head of author relations at SecureFlow, raised a toast to new beginnings. "I have something for you," Stanley murmured, leading her to a quiet corner. He handed her a small package, wrapped in silver paper. Inside, Hazel found a first edition of her favorite novel, the one she'd told him about on their first real date, about a woman who discovered her strength by losing everything she thought she needed. "Open it," he encouraged. On the title page, the author had written a new inscription. "To Hazel, thank you for helping others find their voice by finding your own. Your platform gave me back my love of writing." Tears pricked at Hazel's eyes. This author had been one of her first discoveries at Crimson and Crown, but Jonah's aggressive marketing had nearly destroyed her passion for storytelling. Now she was thriving on SecureFlow, mentoring new writers, reclaiming her art. "How did you—" "I have my resources," Stanley smiled, "and a good reason to use them." Hazel rose on tiptoes to kiss him, not caring who saw. This was real love, supporting dreams, celebrating success, finding joy in giving rather than controlling. The moment was shattered by a commotion at the entrance. "Sir, you're not on the guest list." "Do you know who I am? I own half of publishing in this city." Hazel's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Jonah Vincent stormed into the grand hall, his usual polish cracked by obvious intoxication. The crowd parted before him, whispers rippling through the room. "Quite a party," he sneered, taking in the displays. Technology and tradition, how quaint. "You need to leave," Stanley said quietly, stepping forward. "Do I?" Jonah's laugh was bitter. "I don't think so. Not until I say what I came to say." Security was approaching, but Hazel held up a hand to stop them. "Say it then," she said clearly. "One last time." Jonah's eyes fixed on her engagement ring. "Replacing me already. Moving up the corporate ladder one husband at a time." "That's enough," Stanley warned, but Hazel touched his arm. "No, let him speak. Let everyone hear exactly who Jonah Vincent really is." Something dangerous flashed in Jonah's eyes. "Who I am. I'm the man who made you. Before me, you were nothing but a talented editor with big dreams. I gave you everything, position, power, a place in society." "You gave me a cage," Hazel interrupted calmly. "You took my dreams and tried to make them yours. My success threatened you so much that you had to control it, claim it, own it." "I loved you." The words exploded from him. "No," Hazel said softly. "You loved owning me. Stanley loves freeing me. He sees me as a partner, not a possession." The crowd was silent, watching the drama unfold. Jonah swayed slightly, his composure crumbling. "You think he's different?" he demanded. "All men want control, power, dominance." "No, Jonah, that's just you." Hazel's voice carried clearly through the hall. And that's why you're here alone, watching everything you tried to control slip through your fingers. Crimson and Crown is still mine. Is it? Stanley asked mildly. Last I heard, the board was voting on new leadership. Something about declining market share and questionable management decisions. Jonah's face drained of color. You're behind that, he accused. Working together to destroy me. You destroyed yourself, Hazel cut in. The moment you decided that power was more important than people, now please leave before security removes you. This isn't over, Jonah snarled, but his voice shook. I'll show everyone what you really are. What I really am, Hazel said clearly, is free. Free to love, free to create, free to build something that helps others find their voice. She stepped closer, meeting his eyes. And you know what, Jonah? I'm not afraid of you anymore. The truth of those words rang through her like a bell. She wasn't afraid, not of his threats, his power, or his attempts to control her narrative. She had written her own story, and it was so much better than anything he could have scripted. Jonah stared at her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she had become, strong, certain, magnificent in her freedom. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The silence that followed his exit was broken by spontaneous applause. Hazel found herself surrounded by support, authors she'd championed, colleagues who believed in her vision, friends who had helped her rebuild. Stanley's arms wrapped around her from behind, warm and steady. Proud of you, he whispered in her ear. Later that night, in the quiet of their favorite cafe, Hazel finally let herself shake. I never expected him to show up like that. You handled it beautifully, Stanley said, taking her hand across the table. You showed everyone exactly who you are, strong, compassionate, and wise enough to pity him without letting him hurt you. I do pity him, she realized. He'll never know what real love feels like, real partnership, the joy of helping others succeed instead of controlling them. His loss, Stanley smiled. My infinite gain. Hazel studied their joined hands, his strong and steady, hers adorned with the emerald ring that represented not ownership, but partnership. Everything had come full circle, but the circle was actually a spiral, leading upward to something better than she'd ever imagined. Take me home, she said softly. As their car wound through Manhattan's glittering streets, Hazel leaned against Stanley's shoulder, thinking about endings and beginnings. 1 year ago, she had stood in that same museum, trapped in a gilded cage. Now she was flying free, stronger for having broken those bars, wise enough to choose love that lifted rather than bound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the platform's expansion, their wedding plans, the continuing revolution in publishing. But tonight, held safe in the arms of a man who loved her strength instead of fearing it, Hazel knew one thing for certain. Her story was finally her own to write. Chapter 12. New Dawn Street. Patrick's Cathedral stood bathed in golden morning light, but this time everything was different. Hazel gazed at her reflection in the bridal suite mirror, touching the delicate lace of her wedding dress. Unlike the ornate gown she'd worn for her first wedding, this one was elegantly simple, like truth, like love, like freedom. You look radiant, her mother whispered, adjusting the cathedral veil. The small, intimate ceremony they'd planned was exactly what Hazel had wanted. No society photographers, no corporate politics, just pure celebration of love. A knock at the door made her turn. Hazel? Stanley's voice carried through the wood. I know it's bad luck, but I needed to tell you something. Since when do we believe in bad luck? She called back, smiling. We make our own fate, remember? She opened the door to find him looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, his warm brown eyes filled with emotion. In his hands, he held a package wrapped in cream-colored paper. I wanted to give you this before the ceremony. he said softly, "so you know exactly who you are on this day." Inside the package, Hazel found a leather-bound book. Opening it, she gasped. It was filled with letters from authors whose careers she'd launched, readers whose lives had been touched by stories she'd championed, young editors she'd mentored. Each page spoke of her strength, her vision, her ability to see the best in others and help them achieve it. "I am not giving you away today," Stanley said, taking her hands. "I am not claiming you or completing you. You are already whole, already magnificent. I am simply asking for the honor of walking beside you, building with you, loving you exactly as you are." Tears spilled down Hazel's cheeks as she pulled him close. "How did I get so lucky?" "Not luck," he smiled, wiping her tears carefully to preserve her makeup. "Choice. You chose to be brave, to break free, to believe in love again. I'm just grateful to be the one you chose." The ceremony was everything their first meeting had promised. Genuine, joyful, free of pretense. When Hazel walked down the aisle, she wasn't a possession being transferred or a prize being claimed. She was a woman choosing her own path, her own partner, her own future. Their vows were personal, honest, and real. Stanley spoke of her courage, her brilliance, her ability to make everyone around her shine brighter. Hazel promised to build with him, dream with him, face whatever came as true partners. At the reception in the library of their favorite hotel, surrounded by books and flowers, Hazel looked around at the faces of those who had supported her journey. Authors whose voices had found freedom on their platform, colleagues who had become friends, even Regina Bradford, who raised a quiet toast to stories yet to be written. The news about Crimson and Crown arrived during dinner. The board had voted for new leadership. Jonah Vincent was out, his empire of control crumbling like the walls he'd built around her heart. But Hazel felt no triumph, only peace. Her success wasn't built on his failure, but on her own strength. "May I have this dance?" Stanley asked as the band began to play. He led her to the floor, holding her close but never confining. "Happy?" "More than happy," she replied. "Free, whole, loved." As they swayed to the music, Hazel caught a glimpse of movement by the door. Jonah stood there, watching. But this time there was no rage in his eyes, no need to control or possess. For just a moment their gazes met, and she saw something like understanding cross his face. "You'll regret this," he called out, one last attempt to assert control. Hazel turned in Stanley's arms, facing her past without fear. "The only thing I regret is not believing in myself sooner. Goodbye, Jonah." He stood for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. This time, Hazel knew it was final. The last chapter of that story was closing, making way for something new. Later that night, Stanley drove them to the airport in his vintage Jaguar. Their honeymoon would begin in Paris, then wherever their hearts led them. The city lights sparkled like stars as they crossed the bridge, Manhattan's skyline a testament to dreams built and dreams yet to come. "What are you thinking?" Stanley asked, catching her hand. Hazel smiled, touching the simple gold band that now sat beside her emerald engagement ring. "I'm thinking about stories. How some end and others begin, and sometimes the most beautiful ones are the ones we never saw coming. Like ours, like mine," she corrected gently. "The story of a woman who had to lose everything to find herself, and then, when she was whole again, found someone who loved her strength instead of fearing it." Stanley brought her hand to his lips. "That's just the first chapter, my love. We have so many more to write." As the plane took off into the dawn sky, Hazel thought about the book she'd started writing. Her own story, not just of survival but of triumph, of learning that true love doesn't cage but frees, doesn't control but supports, doesn't dim but illuminates. Some called it a fairy tale ending, but Hazel knew better. It wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, And this time she was writing her own story, page by glorious page, with a man who understood that the most beautiful love stories are the ones where both hearts soar free. The end stop. Before you go any further, how will you find me in this huge world of fake channels? You might think they are Mr. Peter, but they are just using Al to clone my voice. Don't be fooled. Subscribe to my official channel and become part of this beautiful family. Let's stay together and keep the real stories alive.